works, what it introduces to React, and how to use it. So those are some of the things that we'll be taking a look at. So yeah, let's get started. So the first thing is explaining how the project is set up. So basically it's just a simple template where we have like these three components. So this is the parent component, this is the hooked counter component. It's a component which actually we'll be using the hooks within it, and then this other one is now the non-hooked counter component. So the UI and styling will be using Tailwind CSS. This is just Tailwind for getting things faster up and running. Okay, so first of all, apologies, I have a cold, so I'll try and be audible now. So as for the code base, we have them set up like this. So the parent itself, we have like just the app is a parent. It has the hooked counter, non-hooked counter. We have the hooked counter, and then we have the non-hooked counter itself. So all of them, they are functional components, because you go only, the first thing you have to know, you only get to use state within functional components. You cannot be able to use them in class-based components. So that's the first key takeaway you have to take from this one. So how the project is set up and how everything is working, the parent component, you have the parent itself, it will be passing in its value to the child components, which are the hooked counter and the non-hooked counter. And then we have the hooked counter. It's going to have an internal state itself, and then we're going to have the non-hooked counter, which is stateless, completely stateless, as like basically what functional components originally they were built to be. They were built to be stateless, but now with the introduction of React and useState and everything, so it's possible to have useState within functional components. Okay, now for the test, and like the first thing we are going to take a look at is now the useState, how you define it, what is it, how it works, like the method around it. So since we are using it in the hooked counter, so all we need to do is this: you go and import from React. Like I said, the first thing you have to understand, you only get to use it in functional components. You don't get to use it in class components, because class components, they already have a way of working with their own state. So for this one, we'll just call useState from React, and then you notice that we are using this method is called array destructuring. What it does is similar to this. What you can do instead is this: you can say const useState result, and then you have useState, and then that. What this does is it returns some values from itself. So these values are what you are going to be assigning to count and update count. But internally, this is what it's doing. If you go ahead and you say like this useState trace, the first attribute, it will give you the state variable, which is count. That's one thing you have to know. And then when you say useState trace, the second attribute that is returned is going to be the method for updating that state variable. And you notice I'm insisting on state variable. You will see why that's the emphasis: state variable, not just variable, state variable. So with this out of the way, now this is going to translate to useState. This one, this method here on line 5 is going to be assigned to count, and then the second one, line 6, is going to be assigned to update counter. So that's what basically this array destructuring does. And then now when you look at the code, okay, you're wondering like, now how do I get to use the count and how do I get to update it? Because in class-based components, you are used to this.state.count, for example, and then this.update state, this.set state. But that is not going to be possible here. All we need to do is this: to be able to use this state variable, all you need to do is access it. And the way you access it is like the way you have accessed it here. We have accessed it here. So like you just do the curly brackets, and then you put the count there, and then it will be rendered whatever the value is. And then you notice that the value initially is what you are going to pass in here. So in this case, we could have even went with 10. Let's say we go with 10. And then we refresh it. So it's just 10. Could have gone with 1 is 1. You see, so we have it as 0 because normally all counters start at 0. And then so you're working with it, you're interacting with it. So how do you get to update the state variable used within using the useState method? Because here we don't have the state, like we don't have this dot state. Remember, when we created the state, we were given the ability to update it using the update count method, which is attached to it. So you could have named it maybe set new count value, toggle count, change count, but now all we need to do is this. You just say update count and then you call it with the new value for count. Because we are updating by 1, we are incrementing by 1, we put 1. If you want to increment by 2, we can put 2 and then it will just be 2. 20 the same. So all you need to do is just do that. And then after that, you are wondering, okay, so like what is it like? What happens behind the scenes? Like, okay, how is it possible to update this count? Would it have updated if we only have had it as a simple variable instead of a state variable? Okay, to answer your question, to answer that question, let's jump over to our non-hooked counter. So for this one, you'll notice that it has like just the same variable, which is the count, and it has some additional variables which we'll talk about. But before you go any further, this is not how it's supposed to be done. Like, you should never ever, like, it's not the best approach to updating the UI when it comes to working with React. The UI should always be updated, if possible, from the state, so that the state can keep the UI in sync. And then, because the UI will be updated by the state, and the state is only the single source of truth for the whole application. So that's why, I'm saying, this is for educational purposes and this is for demonstration purposes, so that it's possible for you to get to understand why we are doing like this and why we are following this approach. Okay, so to get started, this is what you are going to do. Okay, the first thing is that we look at the parent count variable. Parent count value is 0, local count value is 0. So let's try and increment it the clean way. Okay, we're incrementing, nothing is happening. But if you inspect the console, you are seeing that something is happening. So the methods for incrementing are try to increment non-hooked counter the clean way, and try to increment non-hooked counter the dark way. So for the clean way, is assuming, the assumption is that it's going to rely on the state to update the UI. And the dark way is what I just said. We are going to go a little bit further and do some patching and simply going out of the norm of React, and all the UI should be updated by directly manipulating the elements in HTML. Okay, that's just simple. Let me just show you. So the first method is this: try to increment the counter the clean way. So the clean way is this. Okay, we are trying to increment it the clean way, but nothing is incrementing on the UI. This value is not incrementing, but we are seeing that we are doing a lot, we are doing a lot of incrementing on the console. Okay, that's the first part. So for the second part, we need to now toggle this part here. We need to toggle the second part, to manually set the inner HTML value. And for that, we just do this. When we click it, you'll notice the latest value, which was the local variable. Notice local variable, not state variable, which was the local variable. It has been updating all along. And then when we went the dark way and decided to update the inner HTML, that's why we get the 26. Okay, so that's that. You have noticed two things here. It's not possible to actually update the local variable and have it reflect on the element itself, because the reason is this: nowhere here in the non-hooked counter have you updated the state. You have noticed that. Okay, but why is it? Why do you need to update the state so that the UI can be updated? Okay, this is like, if you are not familiar with how React works, like whenever the state is updated, it will trigger a re-rendering operation. That's why it was possible for us to have an update in the hooked counter, because with the hooked counter, we are actually updating the state variable, which is count, using update count. But here in the non-hooked counter, all you are doing is this, simply updating the local variable. Nowhere have we updated the state in this method, nowhere. Okay, and that is dangerous, because you may say, okay, either way, if I'm not able to update the state, I can update the UI and still changes will be reflected. Okay, that's okay, and that's true, and that's like, that is true, not correct, that is true, because we are seeing like it can be updated. Okay, before we continue any further, the problem with this is that whenever state changes in the parent, what will happen is that the whole render operation will be triggered from like the parent to the children to the children. And when the render operation is triggered, what it will do is it will render the child element itself, the child component, and that will reset the attributes in the child itself. The local variables will be reset. Okay, however, resetting is only for local variables, like only for local variables, but for state variables they will be respected. That's the word, like they are respected. Okay, React will say, okay, the parent container will start rendering, and then it will start rendering the hooked counter. It will see, okay, hooked counter, somehow it has some state variables which it had updated to some point to the value of 10. Okay, and then okay, let's say I'll respect this and I'll pass them on into the render cycle, and then by passing them on into the render operation, they will be rendered. And that's why it's possible to have the latest value that was there, which is irrespective and completely isolated from the state of the parent. So in no way will the parent state affect the state of the hooked counter, in this case the child counter. But when it comes to the stateless component, which is an unhooked counter, this one, it doesn't have state. So the parent will just recall a complete re-rendering of the child component, which is in this case the non-hooked counter. And then this non-hooked counter, because it doesn't have state, these values, the initial value will be 0 for the count. And to demonstrate that, we have this. Remember, we said that our parent will be state aware, so our parent is state aware. And then we need to set the counter for the parent, which we are going to be passing in as a props. And as you know, like, props is basically what you pass in. If you want like data to pass in from the parent to the child components, that's what you are going to pass in as prop, and the prop name will be, in this case, count. So since in this case we are updating the state of the parent, that means that re-rendering will be triggered, and the re-rendering being triggered, it will trigger the re-render like all through the whole application, so that the whole application can be in sync. So to explain that, two things we need to keep an eye on. We need to keep an eye on the count value that is passed into the children. We need to keep an eye on the count value for the children, the local count values. And then we need to keep an eye on the local count value, UI value, the one that we have. And in this case, for this one, also the same. So what that means is that it's going to simply do this. We are going to have the latest value, whether we are going to have the latest value or not. So let's start. We update the parent state. We updated the parent state to 1. You notice this value didn't change. This value, did it change or not? Let's see. We increment, it went to 11, meaning the value never changed. We increment this one, it goes to 1, meaning the value was reset back to 0. You see? So basically this is what happens. Like I said, re-rendering will trigger like the initialization, in quotes, the reinitialization of the whole DOM tree, and then that's why we are having the count value for the stateless component going back to 0 and starting afresh from 1. Even though changes were made, that's okay and that's true, but then like the changes are not persistent. So that's why when we update the parent and parent triggers the re-rendering, each re-render will now make it like starting from scratch. But for the component with the state, it will not start from scratch, it will start from 11, which is the current value, and then you go 12, 13, 14, and then for the stateless one, it will go back to 0 because there was no way it didn't have any state. So like with no state, the render method for this component, it will not have anything that is state worthy to work with. Okay, so I think that's clear. So that's why when we do this and then we update the parent, it resets back to 0, and then that's why we have 1. Okay, because like we're incrementing, because here is 6 and then we update parent and then it gets to 3, and then the value is initially 0, and then we increment, it gets to 1. Okay, so I hope that was clear. So basically that's what happens. So if you are going to take a look at, like, in summary what you have said, for you to simply use state in a stateless in a function component, all you need to do is call useState, and then you pass in like the mutator itself, which is this one. You destructure the value of the mutator, which is that one, and then the value itself is that one. And then the other thing is that the hooked counter, it will behave like as we expect. The state is isolated, completely independent from that of the parent. Yeah, that's why we are having like changes. It's 3 here, we change it. Even if we were to switch it to 0, it will be switched to 0 because the state of the parent and the state of the child, they are completely independent. That's one thing you have to understand. And then there is a problem with the non-hooked counter. The counter, like, it doesn't have state. If it doesn't have state, then there is nothing to reference in the next re-render cycle. Remember that if there is no state, there is nothing to reference in the next render cycle. So the values, the local variables are set to 0. They cannot be picked up from where they were left at. Okay. And then the other thing is that, like, this is just stateless component. It's something that is like depending on the parent inputs, like you saw, like the value, it depends on simply something that is updated. Probes, like, they will be passed in and they'll be displayed whenever there is a change. But now for the local variables, it's not possible because they are not state aware. And then even though the method may change, the internal variables, in this case count changes, that's okay. But the count is changes, yes, but the UI is not updated. Yeah. However, you may go the other route, which is not the best one, of updating it like the dark way, which is this. So you update it, and then when you update it, yes, it will update, but now as you saw, the UI changes and then it changes back to 0, like that. So it is not going to be that useful. Even if you do this, nothing is changing on the UI, but on the console you see it's changing. That means the value is changing, but the UI is not changing, because for the UI to change, the state has to be updated and the render has to be triggered. Okay, so the final thing is that even though the non-state variables are changing, that doesn't mean the UI will change because state is not being updated. Okay, so I think that summarizes this very simple explanation of how to use React hooks, specifically useState. So the first thing is, key takeaways is that useState helps you to use state. Okay, useState makes it possible for you to work with state in a functional component. Second thing is that for the UI to change, like in this case, so for the UI to change, the state has to be updated so that it can trigger the re-rendering. The other thing you saw is that even if it's possible to update the UI like manually using React Ref, it's not the best option, because in this case, as you saw, the values will be reset when the UI is re-rendered from the parent component. Okay, yeah, I think so. That's it. So for the code on this one, I think this is a small code. You can just follow along, or I can just push it to GitHub, and then I leave a link for you guys to follow along. But remember, always write your own code, because that's the best way to learn and that's the best way to follow along. Okay, I think that's it from this one. So thank you guys, and let me know what you think about it.